Hi, everybody. Welcome to Theories of Race Part 2. Today we're going to focus on a theory called the social construction of race. This is associated largely with what both Bonilla Silva talks about in his reading, as well as the the Omi and Winant reading. Really, probably most closely with Omi and Winant. Please note that whenever we have Bonilla Silva readings, it is really dense. So you're going to have to make sure you give yourself extra time to read those things. In terms of the social construction of race, I think it's important for us to think about race as a set of categories. So when we say something like white or black or Asian or Latino or Native American, these are really large categories, as I noted in the previous lecture, that can encompass a lot of different ethnicities and groups. But we need to understand that race is not something that's natural. It's not something that just occurs in the world. But from a sociological point of view, we basically argue that race, or that these categories take on meaning um, because of history, because of news, because of popular culture, through prejudices, stereotypes, etc. And so, what race means, or how we define those categories, are really more about a set of meanings, discourse, ideas, or even what we call common sense understandings. In other words, those things that people believe to be true, whether or not they're true or not, stereotypes, or belief. So, because these are the meaning of race is grounded in things like discourse or ideas or common sense understandings, I think it's I think it's important to understand that the meaning of race is always constantly changing. For example, what it means to be white today in the category of white is not what it meant in 1850. In 1850, the category of white only referred to white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, or in other words, a very specific group from England, those from France, and those from Spain. As I've noted, I think in previous lectures, it wasn't until 1920 that we began to see the expansion, so that groups like Germans and Italians and Irish were also considered white. Up until that point, they were just considered quote unquote dirty immigrants. And so, again, it's important to realize that the meaning of race has changed historically, and it constantly changes because of its connection to these meanings and ideas. Let's do a little quick exercise, and what I'd like you to do is pause this presentation and do this exercise after I give these instructions. First, I want you to look at the circles below. I've numbered them 1 through 6. I want you to divide the circles into 2 categories. You can create the categories based on any of the characteristics in the circle, whether or not it has a black fill or not, or if it has a stripe fill, or if it's blank, it's just white, that it's divided into 4, whatever makes sense to you. You need to divide these into 2 different categories and just put numbers, So for example, if I was going to create 2 categories based, I might choose those that have black fill in one group, which is 1, 3, and 4, and those without the black fill in 2, 5, and 6. What I'd like you to do is to do this 3 different times, and is to basically, I want you to divide these circles. The categories don't have to have an equal amount. So, for example, I might decide to just do one that had the same shade all the way through. 5 is in one group, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6 are in another. But what I want you to do is do this 3 times and create kind of 3 separate groupings. And make sure that after you do the groupings, you explain how you divide the circles into the categories. All right, so if you've actually now completed that, and I'm assuming you're resuming this lecture, what's the correct way to divide the circles? Your answer should be, what do you mean correct? You didn't, you told us we could divide it any way we want. And also, I'm sure that you realize that there are probably about 12 different ways that you could divide up these circles, because all of these circles are colored in differently, no one is the same. What I'd like you to do is to think about those circles as human beings. The categories are the equivalent of racial categories. And note that each circle is unique. And so depending on what characteristic you focus on, there are numerous correct strategies. In other words, the meaning of race is very much like these circles. It really depends on what you're focused on. It depends on what people choose to call out. It depends on what you're emphasizing in any particular moment. And if you look at the history of race in the United States, there was a time in which race was defined by geography. That At other times, it was defined very legally by laws and legislation here in the United States. At other times in the United States history, we know it wasn't about black or white, it was white versus non white. Um, we also know that even today, there are those who are born here versus those who are immigrant. So there's so many different ways in which we divide race. And so these circles, right, basically, these circles um, help show us the meaning of race. How you choose to sort those circles represents the social construction of race. What racial category someone is categorized into can be based on any number of arbitrary characteristics. Um, and historically, this has been phenotype, eye color, hair color, geographic region, legal definitions, court decisions. Sorry, I got a little ahead of myself in the lecture, so I apologize for the redundancy. I think it's important to note that racial categories are not objective, meaning that it's not unbiased, that your history doesn't matter, your perspective doesn't matter. It absolutely matters. So the categories are not objective fact, and they're not naturally given. They're not something that you just assign. People like to say things like, "Well, it matters about your skin color." But think about the fact that at any given time, people with the very same skin color, quote unquote, um, were considered different racial categories. The Italians versus white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right? Um, Spaniards versus those from Portugal. All of that, right? We understand that these aren't necessarily natural. Categories depend on a number of social processes. These social processes include, as I've already talked about, things like popular culture, history, power, fight over scarce resources, all these things that we talked about in the previous theories. And at different theoretical moments, how race is defined can change. So in the reading that you have about Omi and Winant, they really sort of focus very specifically on this idea of the social construction of race. And they argue that it's not just the categories that are important, it is the meanings that we attach to racial categories. They emphasize the importance of studying those meanings. They would look at something, for example, like an episode of Law and Order, or pick any cop drama, quite honestly. And when they would watch these dramas, they would say, why is it that all African American and Latino men are almost always portrayed as criminals, thugs, and gangsters? So, in terms of the social construction of race, they would say race, particularly for Latino and African American men, is connecting the idea of criminality, of being a gangster or a thug or someone who's violent, to the idea of what it means to be Latino or Black. Um, it's a, and so the more you study the way that race is socially constructed, we understand that race is an unstable and decentered complex of social meanings that are constantly being transformed by political struggle. And so when we talk about the political struggle, we understand that social movements play a very important role in changing the way in which people are perceived. Historically, you can look at the civil rights movement, and we understand that that it changed the ways in which that people of color in the United States were treated. I want to be very clear here that the phrasing you need to use is people of color, not colored people. Colored people is a phrase from the 1960s that was meant to be derogatory. It was used as part of segregation. People of color is a term that was used more. They went along with a lot of the laws and history at the time that separated whites from those who were not considered non-white. So, sorry, the little divergence there. But when we talk about race as being unstable and decentered, we understand it's always changing, and that groups of people can try and influence the way in which they're perceived. So you actually can look at the contemporary moment and look at, for example, Black Lives Matter. As a social movement that is trying to point out the ways in which African Americans are being treated, particularly by the police, but by society at large, and pointing to the inequality that's attached to it. It's through this social movement that they're trying to change the way in which African Americans, and in particular African American men, are treated. And so, if they're able to successfully make that change happen, that again shows the way in which the meanings of race can be changed. A central part of understanding the social construction of race is also stereotypes. Stereotypes are oversimplified, generally over-exaggerated belief that all members of a certain group act and think in the same fashion. Individuals use stereotypes as the basis to justify discrimination and racism, or to make claims that certain individuals in a society are better than others. So, for example, we've heard, there's all sorts of stereotypes that you could write down. As someone who's Asian American, a lot of the stereotypes that I've heard, for example, are, Asians are bad drivers. Asians are all good at math. Asians are all super students. They're the model minority. Well, some people will say, well, those are, minus the driving thing, those are positive stereotypes. But the problem is that the assumption that all Asian Americans are good at academics doesn't actually get at the truth of the matter. That when you disaggregate the different groups within Asian, we realize that, for example, outside of the Chinese and Japanese population, you could look at everyone from Filipinos to Tongans to Vietnamese, Cambodians have very high dropout rates. That there is a large disparity in terms of grades and being college ready. And we also know that at times the expectation for perfection gets in the way of actually being able to get things like health services. We know that in a lot of these different communities, stereotypes prevent people from being able to access both physical health and mental health resources. And so what we need to think about is that these stereotypes all have consequences. Another key part of the social construction of race is discourse. Discourse refers to how we think and communicate about people, things, organizations of society, and relationships. It designates the forms of representation, codes, conventions, and habits of language that produce culturally and historically located meanings. It shapes our thoughts, ideas, beliefs, values, identities, and interactions with others, and our behavior. And it's important to note that they are accepted as reality and may not be factually true. In other words, discourse is how we talk about issues. It's what we believe to be true, whether or not it is factually true. Take, for example, some of the things that we see on television. We realize that people will make statements about different racial groups and assume they're true, whether or not they are in fact true or not. It is important for us to separate discourse from facts. Discourse is what people say, whether it's factually true or not. Facts are information that can be checked and backed up with evidence. In other words, that's verifiable. So I'm going to stop this conversation here. Please feel free to answer and ask any questions that you may have.